a few years ago, where, a string of prostitutes, their bodies will go up. Yeah, it is true that there was that period there where you did have these kinds of very larger than life serial murders. And I'm not entirely sure why that is, and I've given that some thought. To some extent, and again, this is just pure speculation, I think something in the culture of the 1970s and so on and so forth released the very, very, violent, extreme sexual stuff. If you have a philosophy which started to take hold in the late 1960s, if it feels good, do it. That could also, inspire, people like, these serial killers who, like, what feels good to them is killing and torturing people. But there's another factor involved, which is, it's very possible there still may be as many serial killers at large now as there were 20 or 30 years ago, which thankfully is not a huge number. What's interesting, though, is we're no longer really, the culture is no longer really so fascinated and obsessed by serial murder. I've studied American crime going back to the 19th century. And one thing that's always struck me is each period seems to have its own signature crime. That is, a certain kind of crime that the culture becomes very obsessed by, because that kind of crime seems to crystallize a lot of anxiety of the moment. So that, for example, back in the late 1800s, the 1890s, and into the early 20th century, Americans were very obsessed with poison murder. And every time there was a poison murder or an apparent poison murder, it had become this huge national story. Some of them, became these sensational kind of trials of the century and so on. And I think it was a reflection, among other things, of the fact that so many Americans, were really terrified about the fact that every time they took some medicine or ate certain kinds of food, they might die because, there was no federal regulation. Being sickened or poisoned by something you ate was a very, very real possibility for a lot of people. And somehow the poisoner, came to embody that fear, that nightmare. Back in the 30s, it was, before the 30s, 1920s, the case of Leopold and Loeb. They kidnapped and murdered this one adolescent. There were many other crimes that were at least as heinous, if not more heinous, going on at the time. But that crime really gripped the attention of the nation, because Leopold and Loeb, again, seemed to be the incarnation of this cultural anxiety, what they call the flaming youth, the youth gone wild. Back in the 80s, it was a serial killer. Now, we've become less obsessed with serial murder. The serial murder has been, I think, replaced in our imaginations with the mass murderer. The person who goes into a workplace and shoots up a whole bunch of people, or a school and shoots up a whole bunch of people. And I think that's a reflection of our, current anxiety, which is obviously the fear of terrorism. I think since 9/11, the mass murderer has replaced the serial murderer as the great boogeyman of the American imagination.
I was going to bring up the school shooting. It's in my notes. I was just about to say the same thing. Now, you mentioned how, like, in the 60s, late 60s and early 70s, there was this free love, kind of do as thou wilt, right? The old Aleister Crowley thing.
Yeah.
Now, have you noticed any connection between all these serial killers and all this kind of stuff with satanic cults and a belief in Satanism? Because there is that cannibalism. Just seems to be a thread.
No, I think there was that whole Satanism hysteria that was going on back in the whenever. Well, I guess it was precipitated, by things like The Exorcist and Rosemary's Baby. But, there was that moment, where there were all these rumors of Satan cults, these people connected with Satan cults. I mean, every now and then, like the Night Stalker, you might get a guy who'll, paint a pentagram in blood, at the crime scene, but that's just whatever. I mean, I don't think there's any genuine Satan worship going on there. So no, I personally do not believe that. And certainly none of the serial murders, I've ever looked at or studied, the notorious ones, Ed Kemper, for example, again, or the ones I've already mentioned, Gacy, Bundy, they had no connection to that and didn't really have anything to do with what motivated them.
One of your books covers Bundy?
Well, only, I've done I did this book, A to Z Encyclopedia of Serial Killer, and the Serial Killer Files. I discuss both of them, but no, the individual, the books that deal with individual serial murder cases.
Gotcha.
Those, the Gein book, really, that's the most recent case that I cover. The other go back to really 1870s. Yeah.
Well, no, but then again, a thread through your books is the cannibalism. Now,
well, no, that's no. I mean, I wrote I believe that the second book I wrote was about Albert Fish, who was a cannibal, and my most recent book is about a cannibal, but not a serial killer. Recent book is about Alfred Packer, who was it's kind of a legendary figure out west, but that's a case of survival cannibalism. It wasn't. He was not a serial murderer. I mean, he was ultimately tried and convicted of killing 5 of his companions, who were all stranded in the wilderness. So in that sense, he was, or at least convicted of being. He always denied that he did it, a mass murderer. But no, I don't think there's any cannibalism in any of other books.
Okay, so you're describing Man-Eater, the life and legend of an American cannibal.
Correct.
Well, give us an idea. What is that story? Because I only read about it briefly, that this guy was traveling across country, then he wound up eating all his friends, I guess, right? So give us an idea what really happened there.
Well, it happened back in 1873. Packer, again, who is a kind of a legendary figure out in Colorado. I taught for a year at the University of Colorado in Boulder, and the student cafeteria is named the Alfred Packer Memorial Cafe. But Packer was a prospector who went with a group of other prospectors into the San Juan Mountains of Colorado. There was a big silver boom at the time. And he and 5 of his companions got lost in the snow. And he emerged several months later, looking unusually well-fed man who had just spent several months snowbound in the wilderness. And they subsequently found corpses of these other men, all of whom had been killed and cannibalized. And Packer never denied that he had lived off their flesh. But he did deny that he did insist that he had not murdered them. He claimed that one of the other guys, that he had been away doing some scouting to see if he could find this Indian agency that was nearby. And while he was gone, one of the other men had murdered his 4 buddies. And when Packer returned, this other man was sitting by the campfire roasting a piece of human flesh, and then he attacked Packer, and Packer killed him in self-defense. And then Packer, again, who was stuck in the wilderness for another 2 months, just a little camp and lived off the flesh of these guys. So Packer again, never denied the cannibalism. And the cannibalism was not even technically a crime. and he claimed he had murdered this one guy in self-defense, but he denied that he'd killed all 5 people. But that claim was, judged to be a lie. And he was, again, convicted and sentenced to death for the murder of these people. That sentence was commuted on a legal technicality. He was retried, convicted of 5 counts of manslaughter, spent about 20 years in prison, and was ultimately paroled. So that's just in a nutshell. But he, as I said, he became a kind of folk figure out west.
And they named the school cafeteria after him? That's a little disturbing, don't you think?
Well, it's weird. He's one of these figures, who somewhere along the line, went from being this detested criminal. Even at the end of his life, there were people, who started to believe the story that he had murdered these other guys. He was sort of seen as some relic of the rugged Old West. Somewhere along the line, he sort of turned into a semi-humorous figure. Actually, guys who do South Park, Matt Stone and Trey Parker, they were students at University of Colorado. They did a very amusing movie about Packer called Cannibal Musical, which is like a deranged Oklahoma or something like that. But so it's part of the sick humor that has grown up around the Alfred Packer legend.
And maybe your next book could be a cookbook, right? Recipes.
So they have an Alfred Packer book. So.
They have an Alfred Packer recipe book?
Yeah.
Oh, my God. Now, that's not funny. Okay. Now, this is sort of similar to the story of the Donner Party, right?
Yeah, very similar. In fact, Packer, at one point was complaining because, the Donner, for the most part, the survivors of the Donner Party, were, kind of accepted back into society. And he was complaining that, people were calling him this human hyena and this man-eater, and he hadn't done anything the Donners hadn't done, and so on. But yeah, it's the Donner Party and the Packer case are really the two most infamous cases of survival cannibalism in the American West.
Now, I'm noticing here on your list here as well that you looked into female serial killers as well.
Correct.
Which it's not as common.
Well, again, it depends on how you define serial murder. One of the arguments I make in that book is the book Fatal, which was about a woman named Jane Toppin, who was a private nurse who ultimately confessed to 31 murders. There was a time, actually, before John Wayne Gacy's crime, the Guinness Book of World Records had her listed as America's most prolific serial killer. So, again, when we think of serial murder, obviously we think of, the guys I mentioned, and somebody like Jack the Ripper, let's say. The Ripper is first modern serial killer. Again, also, obviously, a sexually lust killer. So when people think of serial killers, they think of that. But my argument in my book is that's just the male form of serial murder. And women do not engage in that kind of, sexual mutilation murder. That is particularly male, aggressive kind of crime. But there are many, many, many female killers. They just commit their crimes differently. They tend to be poisoners, as Jane Toppin was. Again, I think among other things, it reflects differences in male-female sexuality. But Jane Toppin was also a sexual sadist. There's a kind of arsenic and old lace image of these women poisoners. It seems like some quaint, sort of crime where you just slip some poison into, somebody's tea or something. But Toppin was she was arguably sexual sadist of an even worse kind than somebody like Jack the Ripper.